My name is Khalil Cumberbatch, and I'm the Associate Vice President of Policy at the David Rothenberg Center for Public Policy at the Fortune Society, and welcome to Both Sides of the Bars, a discussion-driven show that examines the criminal justice system from various perspectives, including those most impacted by the criminal justice system. We discuss critical questions about how the current system works, its intersections with social justice, and highlight the efforts that are being made to improve the lives of everyone that is affected by it. We ask you, the viewers, to spread the word about both sides of the bars and share your comments with us on Twitter at TheFortuneSOC. Today's show is titled Correctional Profiteering, the Money Trail of Mass Incarceration. Over the last few years, there has been an increased attention paid to private industry's role in profiting from the criminal legal system and immigration detention. Companies such as Global Tellink, Horizon, CoreCivic, formerly known as Corrections Corporation of America, and GEO Group are regularly cited at the top of the profiteering list. However, the issue of prison profiteering runs much deeper and wider than the reach of those companies. My guest today is Bianca Tylek, the Director of Corrections Accountability Project. Bianca combines her expertise in both criminal justice and financial services to combat the commercial exploitation of the criminal legal system. Bianca, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Khalil.
So tell our viewers about the Corrections Accountability Project, why you founded it, and what is its purpose.
Sure. So the Corrections Accountability Project is an organization dedicated to eliminating the influence of commercial interests on the criminal legal system and ending the exploitation of justice-involved people. So what does that mean? That means that we challenge any way in which the criminal legal system has been used as a vehicle to extract resources, whether they be wealth, labor, social capital out of communities of color and communities of poverty, through the criminal legal system, right? We have been laundering taxpayer money through this system into private corporations. We have been extracting all of these very valuable resources out of our communities, and often marginalized and vulnerable communities. And so, you know, our main work strives to really challenge that on its face and make sure that every commercial actor that embeds themselves into the criminal legal system has a force to be reckoned with. And we do that sort of in two main ways, exposing the commercialization of justice and sort of public education and narrative shifting, and then also in our advocacy and organizing and empowering people to challenge the industry.
And how are you defining commercial interests?
It's a great question. So we very intentionally use the term commercialization as opposed to privatization. And the reason for that is that private actors are not the only commercial actors, right? There's actually quite a number of commercial actors in this space. It might be private sector, and obviously very often we talk about private sector. Private sector is a big role. They play a lot through lobbying, campaign financing, and all of that, and having that interest in manipulating the system. But they're also hand in hand with the government. The government can at times be commercial actors if they're taking, let's say, a commission off of a contract or off of a rate that's happening. We also know that labor can at times, right? Labor unions can at times be commercial actors in this system. This idea that we move bodies out of our urban communities up north or to rural areas to employ people, right, for jobs. That notion that that's somebody who's now dependent on the system for their own operation, their own livelihood, their own wealth. And then at times, you know, in a really unfortunate situation, we even have nonprofit organizations that are commercial actors. You know, down in Florida, for example, their entire prison labor of the state of Florida's Department of Corrections is run by an organization, a nonprofit called Pride, right? And you have CEOs of this organization taking home multi-six-figure salaries, and by multi I mean, you know, $400,000 and $500,000, while people are earning 11 cents an hour, and they're managing these vocational programs. So there are quite a number of layers of who these commercial actors are, which is deeper and broader than just private.
And how would you define the criminal legal system as it relates to your work? So our
Sure.
viewers have some full context, right? Because
Yes.
there will undoubtedly be folks who are familiar with mass incarceration, criminalization, the criminal justice system in general. But how do you define the criminal legal system as it relates to your work?
Sure. So we define the criminal legal system as sort of the spectrum from like contact sort of with policing through sort of reentry and people being able to make it home. So that means policing, that means surveillance, that means bail, that means probation, court systems, right, into correctional environments, immigration detention, and then back out as you see parole, again, other forms of community corrections and supervision, electronic monitoring, things like that, all the way through, even reentry programming on the outside, and things like that.
Mm-hmm. So I would love for our viewers to hear like why did you start Corrections Accountability Project? Like what led you to that point where you said something needs to be done in this specific niche?
Yeah. Definitely. So it is a very niche and narrow space sort of within criminal justice that we specifically seek to tackle. And what's interesting is even in that being that niche, it's incredibly massive, right? And I think like when I launched the organization, I appreciated that there was a gap in the advocacy community that was specifically targeting the industry and economy that had been built around human caging and control. I didn't quite maybe appreciate just how big that gap was.
Yeah.
And so it's really huge and it's really sad, right? It's an $80 billion industry.
So 80 billion with a B.
$80 billion industry, and that's still conservative, right? In the sense that still doesn't include what families are spending to call their loved ones inside, right? $80 billion is only what the government can account for, that the government has paid for, right? But we know that families are paying for phone calls, that support networks are paying for commissary, right? That there's all these other things that have latched on, electronic monitoring fees, right? Parole and probation supervision fees, all of that stuff that's coming out of the community, that's not even included in that $80 billion. Right? So it's important just to understand that. But for me, this work is personal. I came, started growing, I was a youth that was involved in the system, had a number of sort of close friends and comrades that had sort of grown up with that had been through this system. And so I always knew that I wanted to at some point work on criminal justice issues. I just didn't really know exactly where my role would be, right? Like, would I be working with at-risk youth? Would I be working with, people coming out? Would I be working in the system, outside the system? Like, where is your role, right? And so I took a few years to specifically figure that out. And I was sitting on the boards of foster care agencies. I was working with a lot of youth of incarcerated parents, then ran actually a program at Rikers that I founded back in 2012 with a number of colleagues that was doing educational programming, right? That's actually where we originally met years ago. And so, doing all of that, sort of figuring out my role. And at the time I was in this really strange place called Wall Street. And I was literally working as an investment banker for a number of years, and I had developed all these skill sets, tool sets, if you call them, right, in finance specifically. And so when I finally left finance and I felt like I had started to figure out, like, okay, it's my time, like I want to go into criminal justice full time as a career, I went to law school and I started again. It was like kind of popping around different places. I had worked at the ACLU, I had worked at multiple advocacy organizations actually. I had actually also worked at a number of DOCs, which was interesting and different type of experience.
DOCs being
Departments of Correction, correct. And then I came out, and the thing that was interesting to me, or that I wanted to spend some time focused on, was how departments of correction often outsource their services, and how this was over the last 30, 40 years had become a more regular thing, and that market, that industry continued to expand. And to me, there seemed to be a lot of power there and not a lot of systemic work being done to challenge it. And I sort of felt like, well, here we are as advocates, reformers, organizers, activists, challenging a system, running into a wall consistently because we're talking to legislators, right, and all these other people who are just behind the scenes being paid, right, by like the industry. And so as we keep running into a wall and keep moderating our message and keep compromising our values to try to get it to fit within the industry that's been created, that was when I realized, well, why don't we just like dissolve this wall? Right? And try to dismantle like the barrier, and then this stuff can get through. And so I realized at that time that it felt like there may be a gap sort of in the criminal justice advocacy space of people who had like financial sophistication and business acumen. And that's like to know sort of shade to anyone is just like, well, most of our field, right, and as you know, is made up of attorneys, made up of social workers, made up of generally people who are sort of on the like more humanities and passion and touch side, right, a lot of directly impacted people. Not a whole lot of former bankers, right? Like that's not where you see a whole lot of people in our field. But I all of a sudden realized that the skills that I had developed to build companies, I can now use to dissolve them. And that was where the concept sort of came out and what we seek to do.
Yeah. So talk a little bit about recently, within the last 5 or 6 months or so, New York City decided that they would no longer charge for phone calls for people who were in city jails. So can you talk to our viewers a little bit, explain that a little bit better than I did, what that actually means, what that means for the profiteering apparatus that was connected to that, and ultimately how this is a trend that we're seeing, that we're hoping to see more of across the country.
Sure. So yeah, so this was a really, really exciting, obviously big win for us. We led a coalition back through the spring and early summer that offered up this legislation, that worked with City Council to get this legislation passed. And in July, we were able to get a bill passed that, as you said, makes New York now the only jurisdiction in the country where calls out of its city jails will be free. I say will be because it's 270 days from the enactment, and it was signed into law by the mayor in August. And so we're roughly looking at May-ish of 2019 when calls will finally be free. And what is that, like what's the impact of that? On a conservative estimate, we estimate that it's roughly $10 million a year for the directly impacted communities here in New York. And obviously, it means so much more for those who could never have called in the first place because they didn't have the financial support in order to do that, right? And so that was a really remarkable, I think, piece of legislation, but also there's so much layered into that, right? So one thing that like people didn't necessarily know is that New York actually was collecting an 81% commission on the cost of calls prior to this bill, right? So this bill also includes language that, while sort of irrelevant at this point, was necessary to address, which is that the city of New York will also never take a commission on something, on telephone calls or something like this. And thinking about New York as a really liberal and progressive city, especially the liberal and progressive beacon of New York State, it was interesting that New York State had a law that prevented it from collecting commission, and yet New York City was still doing it, right? So it was time when we caught up with like the rest of the state system, and then did something better, right? And realized that like opening up those lines was so super important, and that's what we're obviously trying to relay to so many more people. So that's a big part of it. I think the other thing that was an important sort of factoid as we were talking about this bill was that back in the early 1990s, 1991, I think was when Rikers population was at its peak. It was roughly 2.5 times what it is, almost 3 times even what it is today. And yet calls were free at that point. So I don't like saying that New York is the first city to make it free, because it used to be free everywhere prior to like the 1980s, 90s, right? Even 2000s, when these companies started coming in and convincing departments of correction that you need surveillance on these calls. And so if you need surveillance, you need a new phone system, and you need a system that you can charge really exorbitant rates on, because you're paying for our technology patents and all these other ridiculous things that I'm convincing you are necessary, but that never existed before, right? And so that's how they made their entire market. It's how they continue to make their market. It's one of the reasons that one of the things we want to push next is ending the surveillance of calls. And knowing that this was not a thing we always did. This is not a thing that's necessary for safety or or security. That the reality is, like, I love asking a DOC person the last time they intercepted anything because of a phone call that they surveilled, as opposed to just turning over all of these records to district attorneys who can now prosecute people, especially when we're talking about a jail environment where we're largely there with pretrial people. So undermining their ability to like sell that notion of surveillance could essentially dissolve that industry as being necessary, because once you do that, you can bring in Verizon or AT&T, outfit the facility, and calls be like negligible in cost, right? And so in this particular case, the city took on the cost. It was roughly $8 million to the city. The city obviously doesn't pay tax on it to itself, didn't have to pay deposit fees, right, that families had to put on, and all these other costs. So they acquired that, and a lot of people started saying, well, then what does that mean taxpayers are now paying for it? I'm like, well, those other family members' support networks are also taxpayers. So let's talk about that. So were the people that you just stuck in prison and yet are still innocent, right, of crimes like they were a second ago, in theory, until you did that. But more important, like, even the comparison was like relevant, right? $8 million compared to a $1.4 billion DOC annual budget. Just the DOC's annual budget, right?
So the New York City Department of Corrections annual budget is
$1.4 billion.
And here we are focusing on how the city spent $8 million.
Right. And we're worried about that, right? And it's like, this was actually described by a staffer within the city council as equivalent to a rounding error. And I was like, then why are we fighting for this if it means that our vulnerable communities can get something back? Because I promise you, for them, what translated to about $10 million is not a rounding error, right? That is people being able to feed their children, people being able to like pay their rent, right? Their bills and their electricity, for food, all of this stuff. So that was sort of a lot of the conversation around that, and fighting for that, and we were really, really obviously thrilled that it passed, and it passed, I mean, really almost across the board. We had it was 42-3, I think the final vote was. So I think the future of what does that look like, we are talking now to other cities across the country, cities and states that are thinking about what does this mean for us, and what might that look like. Obviously, for us it was easier for us to get this done in New York because of all the incredible advocacy energy, right, that is happening in New York, like Close Rikers, like all these different initiatives, that without those entry-level conversations, that makes a win like this really like palatable and seemingly easier. Like, it's harder. So talking to other cities that may or may not have that right energy going on in their city and what that might look like. But definitely exploring opening that up, as well as addressing all of the other types of ways that the city as well as private companies are allowed to make revenue. So commissary, right? Disciplinary tickets, like you sort of name it, there's someone collecting a fee or some kind of other revenue. And so exploring what that might look like, we're talking about like, what does it mean for us to have a zero revenue system?
And there's been a similar national wave of folks trying to think more creatively about how to implement technology for people while being detained or incarcerated. Some of the most common things are like kiosks that will be placed in the housing units. There are folks who are being detained, who are being imprisoned, who actually think that that's actually a more efficient way. Similar with with tablets, right? Like there are folks who've been incarcerated, multiple decades, and having access to a piece of technology prior to being released would help them acclimate. There are folks who are incarcerated that actually look at that as a benefit.
Yeah.
What would you say to their families about what that actually means when they present a piece of technology? What are the tethers that actually come with that?
So this is, I think, one of the more complicated questions and like frustrating questions, right? Because there's no doubt that the tablets in many ways and introducing this technology can be beneficial on some levels. They always like using the solitary confinement like example, somebody having a tablet in solitary confinement, but then my response is always like, take them out of solitary confinement, like don't give them a tablet and now you've solved the issue of solitary confinement.
Because most folks in solitary are not there for violent acts, they're there for violating some miscellaneous rule in the facility.
Right,
including
exactly.
sometimes struggling from addiction.
Right, 100%. And sometimes people are in solitary for totally other reasons that actually aren't even a violation of any rules, right? It might be like you're in ADSEC just permanently for a really long time. Or you're in protective custody. Sometimes those populations are also. I've seen 15-year-old pregnant girls in solitary confinement because there's simply no other juvenile girl in the jail. And that is effectively solitary confinement, even if it's not directly positioned that way, right? So in any case, so like using these tablets as a way to necessarily solve that problem and cure for those issues is like super problematic. But even when you think about the general population, yes, there's some utility to it. There's the ability to, in theory, be able to submit a PREA complaint or a,
and what's PREA?
Sorry, Prison Rape Elimination Act. So anything, with regard to those type of things without, or a grievance without the like threat of, as they say, retribution or something. So there may be some of those positive aspects. I do think the technology thing and the idea, as you were just mentioning, somebody's been serving 20 years, 30 years, and they get a tablet. Now, I just want to be very clear, these tablets are the most rudimentary version of like something you could potentially call technology.
So it's not an iPad.
It is not an iPad. It is nowhere near like the same type of technology that we're interacting with. This is like the type of technology that like you would let your 2-year-old play with because they like have big buttons and like don't understand what's quite going on. So, and just like poor devices, like the device themselves are like just really antiquated. And like if you ever put that into like the free world and like had to compete with the rest of technology, like all of these companies would fail. But on top of all of that, it introduces a vehicle for extraction. And that's the number one thing these tablets are, right? So everyone started talking about how JPay, this like major tablet company, there's a few of them, but began introducing tablets, and they gave away for free, however you want to say it, 52,000 tablets in New York State, right? And they're like, oh, they're free, don't worry, the taxpayers aren't going to be paying for them, all of this. With that contract, it was worth $8.8 million to the company, right? And that's because on this tablet, now you can buy albums for $46, a music album. I'm just like not sure what you're purchasing for that. You can, now they're gonna start doing video calling, right? Another thing that's like super problematic, because while they claim to be introducing, more access, what they're really doing is also shutting out in-person visits, right? And so $9 for a 30-minute video conference, right? They have the opportunity now to do a money transfer, as you were saying, these kiosks, right, and all this stuff. A money transfer now in New York State under JPay of $10 costs $3.15 if you do it online, and $4.15 if you do it over the phone, right? So like, there's no company, no for-profit company in anywhere that is just going to be giving away its main product unless it's looking to get something back. And these things are just introducing that.
So very briefly, with the limited amount of time that we have left, I would love to talk a little bit about immigration detention and how there is tremendous amount of profiteering being made from that. What is like the biggest unknown factor of how profiteering is deeply entrenched in immigration detention?
Yeah, so I think quickly, I'm just going to spew out a few factoids, and I feel like those kind of nail it. So 72% of immigration detention beds are privatized. 72%, right? That's like the majority, obviously, of the system. All of the electronic monitoring within ICE is actually owned by Geo Group. This is another company that gets that is part of that 72%, right, and has a lot of those beds, and often charges as much as a few $100s a month for someone to be on an ankle bracelet in the ICE system, actually far more than often we have in the criminal legal system.
That person has to bear the cost of.
Correct.
That person or their family.
Right, and then those companies will threaten to say, if you don't pay this, you're going to be deported, or you're going to, right, you'll be back in this system. So this threat of like deportation, right, of changing somebody's entire like life and just ousting them from everything they know. So I think, and for example, the company that has the contract for the telephones in ICE, Taunton, there's again one unilateral provider for all immigration detention. After doing quite a bit of research, we found that Taunton, about 3 or 4 layers down, is actually all of those contracts are owned by GTL, by Global Telek. And so once again, like owning that. So it's a tremendous business. It's 25% of the revenues for CoreCivic and Geo Group, each of those biggest providers of private prisons, and a space that's highly manipulated by corporate interests.
Yeah. So what do you want the viewers to know, again, in the last minute or so that we have, about Corrections Accountability's work? How can they get in touch with you? How can they learn more?
Yeah, so we have some incredible projects going on right now. We have an art gallery going on.
Which is amazing. I saw it. It's beautiful. The artistry is just amazing. The talent is tremendous.
It's 99% currently incarcerated art, all speaking on this issue of commercializing justice, right? And we paid all the artists, which was a really exciting thing that we were able to do. So I really encourage people to go to our website. Our website is www.correctionsaccountability.org. You can check out the art there, the online version. Also come by our offices and see the in-person gallery at 40 Rector. The information's all there. And follow us on Twitter, on Instagram, on Facebook at Corrections PROJ.
Okay, awesome. Bianca, thank you. We could continue this conversation for another hour, but thank you for joining us. Thank you to the viewers for tuning in as well. If you're interested in finding out more about the Fortune Society, please check us out on the web at fortunesociety.org or on Facebook by typing in The Fortune Society. This is Khalil Cumberbatch, and I appreciate you joining us as we critically look at both sides of the bars.